We've got a terrific program, and so you can continue eating, but not talking. I'm Carla Hills, and I am honored that Adam Posem invited me to chair the event today. I've been a member of the Peterson Institute's board for a lot of years, and in my opinion, I can honestly say that I know of no think tank that does a better job on international economic issues. India's Rise, a strategy for trade-led growth, which the Institute is releasing today, documents the importance of India to the global economy. It points out that India is growing faster than any other large country today, and it has the potential to do even better. As the authors say, even much better, and also to be a global trade leader. This study offers a strategy of how these economic and policy goals could be achieved, and it suggests how the United States could help in that process. If you have not already done so, you can pick up a copy of the report out on the table as you came in the lobby. And you can also have access to a free PDF on the website, PIIE.com. And the Institute, in addition, publishes its briefings on free ebooks through Kindle, Nook, or Google Books. And you can find those links on its website. With its usual skill and timing, the Institute is releasing this study before three very important meetings that will be discussing the economic relationships between our two countries. Two will occur next week. The U.S.-India Strategic and Economic Dialogue will hold its initial meeting, and the U.S.-India CEO Forum will hold its regular meeting. And shortly after those meetings, President Obama and Prime Minister Modi will meet and talk again, and we hope that this study will inform those discussions. Now, the study was prepared by Dr. C. Fred Bergston, the founding director and CEO of the Institute from 1981 to 2012. Fred remains a full-time senior fellow at the Institute, as well as director emeritus and a member of the Institute's board of directors. He also serves as a member of the President's Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations and co-chair of the Private Sector Advisory Group to the U.S.-India Policy Forum, composed of trade ministers of the two countries, and that forum will be meeting in late October. Now, Fred's resume is extraordinarily impressive, but time constraints require me to be undiplomatically brief and just say that in his earlier incarnations, he served as Assistant Secretary for the Treasury and also Assistant for International Economic Affairs to Dr. Henry Kissinger at the National Security Council. And he's authored or edited more than 40 books on economic issues. After Fred summarizes the study's conclusions and policy recommendations, three very distinguished leaders and speakers will offer their perspective on today's topic, and they will proceed in this order. From the U.S. government, the Honorable Nisha Biswal, Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs, who took office in October of 2013. She will be followed by the very distinguished ambassador from India, the Honorable Arun Singh, who has served his government for more than 3 decades, and this is his third assignment in the United States. And then from the business community, Nelson Cunningham, president and co-founder of McLarty Associates and a member of the board of directors of the U.S.-India Business Council. And before I invite Fred to the podium, I do want to convey the Institute's deep appreciation to the U.S.-India Business Council for its strong support of this project. Nelson Cunningham, whom you will hear from shortly, and Dr. Aghi, the president of the council, who is with us at head table, have been deeply engaged in this effort, and it's just wonderful to have both of you at this program today. So Fred, I invite you to the podium, and we very much look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you, Carla, for the wonderful introduction and especially for chairing the event today. I, too, want to thank Assistant Secretary Biswal and Ambassador Singh and Nelson Cunningham for being on the program today. I know the Secretary has to leave a little early. She's got an incredibly intense schedule with all the India and other South Asia events coming up the next week or so, but we're delighted she could find some time to join us. I, too, want to emphasize our gratitude to the U.S.-India Business Council, Mukesh and his team, the board of the council, who really have been enormously supportive and enormously helpful in this whole project. The goals of the study that you get today are really threefold. One is to examine the case for a new trade policy for India. Second is to offer a roadmap by how one could implement such a policy. And third is to suggest how the United States could help in that process. And so the study proceeds on all three of those counts. I'll summarize them quickly. But let me first give the punchline up front and do so in rather stark form. The punchline is really that India faces a critical and rather dramatic choice. On the one hand, if India continues to remain largely outside the expanding network of international trade agreements in the region and globally, like the plurilaterals in the WTO, it is going to face increasing economic losses from trade diversion, discrimination against it by these new preferential agreements. We quantify that in the study. I'll elaborate, but it's going to run to $50 billion or more per year of losses that are going to subtract from India's economic results. On the other hand, if it participates fully in this emerging and developing network, our study shows it could expect expanded exports of as much as $500 billion per year, a decade out after all this process came through to fruition, which would boost its economy by 5 to 10%, enable it to achieve its economic goals, and make a dramatic difference in India's role in the world more broadly, as well as its economic fortunes. Now, that's the stark dichotomization that I conclude in the study faces India. I will try to spell out the analytic case for those conclusions with 10 propositions, hopefully done in rather brief form. Proposition number one, India must grow at something like 8 to 10%. It's got to do that to create enough jobs, 1 million new entrants to the labor force every month. It's got to do it to reduce poverty, which still engulfs 250 to 300 million Indian citizens. It's got to get growth up into that range if it's going to be able to meet those goals. Doing so would, of course, enhance India's global status in an international political and security sense. After all, it was 10% growth for 3 decades that catapulted China to where it is, and India, we sincerely believe, could be the next example of that kind of economic progress, economic miracle, if you will, that would take India to that next and central stage in the world economy. Those growth goals, 8 to 10% a year, are the objectives of the Modi administration. It is essential for India, and it's the predicate for this study. Proposition number two, meeting those growth goals will require India to achieve export growth in the double-digit terrain, more than 10%. No country in history has ever achieved the growth rates we're talking about, 8 to 10%, without rapid increased integration in the world economy, globalizing to a major degree. You can look at all the growth miracles of the past in Asia and elsewhere, and you will find that conclusion is unassailable, absolutely correct. So it's essential, if India is going to grow that fast, it's got to expand its international engagement. When India itself was growing rapidly a decade ago, it was expanding its trade at rates like that. But as I'll say, that has tended now to level off in a major way. One reason why that international expansion is required is to enable India to participate in global value chains to a much greater degree than it is now. The creation of global value chains is the business model of practically every major company in the world. But India has a ranking of 140th out of 189 countries ranked by the World Bank on ease of doing business. That limits substantially its appeal and its ability to play into the global value chains. Prime Minister Modi has quite rightly said, I want to vault India into at least the top 50 in that ranking. If they do so, that will go in a huge direction of helping the globalization, the international expansion that the country needs. Proposition number 3. Facing this need for export expansion, India, unfortunately, is going in the other direction. Proposition 3 is that India's exports have actually been stagnant, properly measured, for the last few years. India has internationalized a great deal over the last several decades, and it had a trade boom in earlier years, but it has clearly been losing competitiveness in a big way. There are figures in the book that show that the ratio of exports to GDP in India have been flat for several years. Particularly true in the two big components that are necessary, manufacturing and services. Our studies show that manufacturing exports have got to expand by 12, 13% a year at least to get the overall export expansion that is needed to achieve the economic growth goals. But manufactured exports as a share of the economy have literally flatlined the last few years, as have services, where we think of India as being hugely competitive, as it is, but that too has stopped growing. Those numbers, exports to GDP of both manufacturers and services, are below the peak that they reached in 2008 before the global recession hit. They have not yet re-achieved those peaks, and that's an indicator, another indicator of lost competitiveness. Another key indicator is, and this is also a figure in the book, when you look at India's export growth compared with world GDP growth, again, it's flatlined. In earlier years, up till 5, 6, 7 years ago, India's ratio, its responsiveness to global growth, was very impressive. The elasticity was well up 2, 3, 4. Now it has flatlined. Another indicator that for the last 3 or 4 years, India has leveled off. The trade deficit, the merchandise trade deficit, has hit record levels the last 2 years. Fortunately, the current account is okay because of services exports. Current overall balance of payments is okay because of capital inflows. But again, an indicator of the flattening of Indian export competitiveness in the face of the need to expand rapidly. The government's own economic survey, which it put out last spring, clearly recognized this problem and realized that the trend is going in the wrong direction from what is needed. Now, proposition number 4, which I already hinted at before, is that the situation will be worsened by increasing discrimination against India's exports from the mega-regional and some other trade agreements that are now being put in place. Now, this is especially true, of course, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The U.S. will soon be discriminating against Indian exports of textiles and everything else in favor of Vietnam, in favor of Malaysia, in favor of countries that are in the TPP. But it's not just the U.S., Japan, Australia, the other TPP members will, by the nature of the beast, be treating each other preferentially and discriminating against the outsiders, of which, for today's purposes, India is, of course, the most important. But it's not only TPP. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which you may not think of in this context, is taking place between India's two major markets, the United States and the European Union. And they're going to be putting in place some new preferences between themselves. There's some studies in Europe that show very big trade discrimination against India, China, other outsiders from that arrangement as well. And so that, too, paints a picture of Indian trade going in the wrong direction from what they need. The most interesting thing about TPP, to me, is not so much bringing this project to conclusion, which, of course, must be the priority now, but what happens next? Because immediately TPP takes effect, the question will be, who else joins it? All the rest of APEC is, at least in theory, eligible. At least half a dozen countries have already indicated their desire to join. Almost certainly, TPP is going to expand. It may eventually wind up including all or most of Asia, including perhaps China. And that, of course, then would add hugely to the discrimination and preferences against outsiders for today's purposes, particularly India. I mentioned China. Who knows if China will come into the next round of the TPP, or whether the TPP will morph into a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, as the Chinese themselves were promoting all through their chairmanship of APEC last year, and as a study will be coming to the APEC leaders at their summit next year. China, according to one of my good friends at the top levels of the US government, tells me that not a week goes by when they don't get an inquiry from China about what's happening with TPP, whether it's going, what about the future, what about possible expansion in the future and all that. We don't know what China will do. But if China joined, certainly then the whole rest of Asia would feel compelled to join. And if India remained outside at that point, that's where really mega-billion losses would occur for the Indian economy, undermining all the growth goals that they have in mind. It's not just trade diversion. The members of TPP, of course, are also going to be putting in place cutting-edge standards on a whole range of issues, writing new rules of the game. Countries outside will inevitably not be able to take full advantage of those, even if they try to emulate. That will further erode their competitiveness, further undermine their ability to achieve the kind of trade and economic gains that they need. Now, I'm citing numbers, $50 billion or more of losses. Those numbers, I have to tell you, as somebody who uses models, we put them in the study, of course, those numbers always understate the reality. When you go back and look at how our projections, everybody else's projections for future trade agreements panned out in practice, they always come out understating. They can't capture the dynamics of investment incentives, a whole range of intangibles that make the actual results of trade agreements more substantive, more expansive than the notions that we put into the original econometric models. And so I cite the numbers that come out of our models, both pro and con, but in a case like this where I posit significant trade diversion, it could very well be more for countries that are outside. So the point is that on its current path, which is outside this agreement, these mega regionals, but some others I'll mention shortly, India will subtract from its economic performance via its trade policy, and therefore, we would think, needs to look at a new approach. Proposition number 5, Indian trade policy has been unresponsive to this rather daunting prospect of economic losses. India is not participating in any of the big plurilateral agreements in the WTO, even ones that would seem to play to its strengths, like the Trade and International Services Agreement, like the Environmental Goods Agreement, where India is developing a renewables industry, but seems to be defensive rather than offensive in taking the opportunities provided by some of these new trade negotiations. On the bilateral side, India has certainly put in place a number of free trade agreements, so-called free trade agreements, but in fact, everybody, I think, inside India as well as outside, agrees that these have been pretty weak, fairly unsubstantive agreements. In fact, they're widely referred to as Swiss cheese agreements, both inside and outside the country, because they have so many holes, so many exclusions, and don't deal with. There's been negative reaction within India, I know, recently, to the results of its free trade agreements. And I fully understand the disappointment that its FTAs have not generated much by the way of exports. But the reason is India wouldn't put its own sensitive sectors on the table. It therefore had no leverage to get the other countries to open up the sectors of interest to India, and so naturally, the export potential was not realized. And likewise, on the Indian side, very little gain in terms of more imports, adding to the competitiveness of Indian industry itself. So the basic point is that India, we conclude, needs a major policy transformation if it is to achieve its trade and thus its overall economic objectives. So, how to do that? Proposition number 6. First and foremost, this requires adoption and effective implementation of Prime Minister Modi's domestic reforms. The goods and services tax, the reform of the labor law, the reform of land use, the widespread subsidies in the energy sector and others, the need for huge investments in infrastructure, all of those things are essential to generate increased competitiveness for India and enable it to move down a trade path. All of those reforms are essential to enhance India's competitiveness as well as its economic growth and enable it to then get back on the export expansion path. Proposition 7. But those reforms will have to add to them specific trade reforms to enable India to achieve the kind of outcomes that I talked about before. The need here is to open foreign markets to Indian exports and to increase domestic competitiveness by increasing imports, cheaper intermediate inputs to Indian industry, anti-inflation effects of increased imports to keep competitive pressure on the Indian market. Those two sides of the trade equation are essential to complement the domestic reforms that the Prime Minister has already laid out. Now, there are direct links between those international steps and domestic reforms. On the one hand, domestic competitiveness improvement enables international liberalization. Once you strengthen your domestic base, you're headed in that direction, then of course, you've got more courage to open your markets and thereby insist that other countries open theirs. At the same time, international liberalization promotes the domestic reforms because when you do have a prospect of opening export markets, it gives then a greater payoff for domestic firms, domestic industries, domestic labor, and therefore encourages them to go ahead with the domestic reforms that are needed on the supply side to permit that kind of outcome to occur. And remember, too, that international liberalization greatly enhances domestic institutions within a developing country, which is always a key need. For example, by reducing corruption, making transparent borders a more widespread feature of the economy, the whole range of trade facilitation steps that reduce the incentives, the tendencies, the opportunities to divert from the kind of economy, not to mention society, that you want. To me, the clincher for this part of the discussion is how many other key countries have pursued just such a strategy. This is exactly what China did when it joined the WTO. It did it explicitly to improve the prospects for domestic reform in China. This was Zhu Rongji, Jiang Zemin, accepting the so-called conditions of WTO entry, and then sending their people around the country, to the provincial chiefs, to the party officials all over the country, saying, fellows, here's the new rule book. You may or may not like it, but these are the rules. And those rules were intended by the center to promote the domestic reforms. And it worked like a charm, and we know what the results have been in China. But it's not only China. When Mexico joined NAFTA, it was with exactly the same motivations in mind. And in fact, they've put their history of a financial crisis every decade behind them. And Mexico is now at least a quasi-advanced country. They're in the OECD. Korea, with its widespread program of free trade agreements with almost everybody in all directions over the last decade to escape the middle income trap, a strategy of using external liberalization to promote internal reform. And right now, a bit different situation from India, but Japan, Prime Minister Abe coming in and explicitly bringing Japan into the TPP in order to promote domestic reform, agriculture, cosseted services sectors, various elements of the Japanese economy that he rightly concludes have to be reformed if Japan is going to overcome its 2 decades of decline. So it's a tried and true strategy. In fact, India is one of the very few countries which has not pursued this strategy of competitive liberalization to promote strengthening of its internal economy and carry out its reforms. Doing so now would add an essential element, I feel, to the Prime Minister's reform program. It would enable it to achieve its growth, job creation, and poverty reduction objectives. Proposition 8. Some of those needed trade reforms can be carried out unilaterally. Be done quickly, fairly quickly. Domestic politics will always slow it down a bit in a vibrant democracy like India. But unilateral reforms can go part of the direction, as India itself has done in the past, as China did in a big way in the kind of reforms that it mentioned, that I mentioned for it before. India is, in fact, starting to do that to some extent. India has just promulgated its reform program for the automobile industry, aiming to quadruple growth of the auto sector by 2026. And part of that is going to be to reduce import barriers to raw materials and intermediate inputs to improve the prospects for the competitiveness of the auto industry. That's exactly the kind of thing called for here. It's a step in the right direction. Hopefully, it's a harbinger of more to come. I would add at this point, because some of you have been missing that element in the discussion so far, I would add the point that some unilateral steps by India will almost certainly be necessary to convince its trading partners that it is headed down a new path. I recently spent a few days with some colleagues here briefing top officials of the U.S. government on this forthcoming study and suggesting that it might be helpful to them. And I must say the response we got, while it was very positive and very encouraging and very hopeful that this kind of program would go forward, was also laced with a lot of skepticism based on the history of India's trade policies and its reaction. One of the very top officials, again, I won't name names, said they still say no to almost everything. And of course, with that kind of backdrop, the prospects for getting the kind of international cooperation we need in this area would be limited. And so, simply to note that as India hopefully launches into a program of this type, some unilateral measures, not just rhetoric, I think, but some specific policy changes will probably be necessary to convince the rest of the world that a new approach is being implemented. That's important to convince other governments. It's also important, critical, to convince the private sector, the private investors, to believe that there will be a new day in India in terms of these variables that will then be more conducive, more attractive for them to come in. And if they do take that change in view, then I suspect there could be quite a flood. India will probably have to address some of the long-standing trade disputes on intellectual property rights, on local content, on tax policies. It's obviously up to India to decide what it wants to do, but I think it's probable that some set of measures of that type will be necessary to get the process going. They could move forward on the bilateral investment treaty that's under negotiation with the United States, though I have to say the latest draft model Indian BIT proposal would not help the process, and I hope it is modified substantially before it goes final. So unilateral steps are going to be key, both substantively and to launch the process in a credible way. But the experience, again, of other countries shows that unilateral steps can only go so far. They can bring down high protection, so-called water in the tariff. They can bring down a lot of protection, but then they get down to some level, and it seems to be around 10 to 15% tariffs or tariff equivalents, where the going really gets rough in terms of domestic politics. And you have to then invoke the political economy of trade policy, which is to do negotiated liberalization, where you can mobilize your exporters to come in and say, yeah, it's going to be painful to some of our colleagues to reduce import barriers further, but it's really in the overall national interest, and here's why. And that domestic politics, again, has been used in country after country, including our own, in order to carry trade liberalization through to the desired final stage. So proposition number 9, and I'm getting almost to the end, there are 10. Proposition number 9 is that fortunately, there are a number of options for negotiated liberalization that India could pick up on if it is so inclined and decides to go down this reform path. A fairly simple one is to dust off and beef up some of its existing Swiss cheese FTAs. Some of those already provide for subsequent stages. They start with goods, then they go to services, then they go to more difficult issues. And some of India's FTA partners, like Japan, like Korea, are fully capable of going further if India would go further. And so that might be a low-hanging fruit that might be pursued at an early stage. India could do new bilateral agreements. It's been negotiating with the European Union since 2007. That's been on ice for a couple of years because of Indian reluctance. That could be restarted. The EU would like to do it. And so that would be another both substantive step and signal of India moving forward. An important one, and I mentioned that briefly before, is for India to join some of these plurilateral agreements that are being negotiated in and around the WTO. The most obvious, I think, is the Trade and Services Agreement, where India is very competitive. It does have internal pockets of protection, to be sure, which means it has a lot to offer and could actually get a lot of its objectives if it were willing to put some of its own restrictions on the table. The Environmental Goods Agreement, which has started more recently, it's still at an early stage. India could come in and help shape that. The Government Procurement Agreement, which has been constantly kind of under renegotiation, would be another opportunity for India. We had a backup study done for my study, I refer to it, which shows that India could get big gains, $8–10 billion a year of additional exports, simply if it got 1 or 2% of the government procurement market worldwide by taking part in the GPA and therefore getting inside the preferential network. That's another agreement whose benefits only go to participants. And so if you're outside, you're discriminated against. If you come in, then you get benefits, and our study showed you can get some fairly significant gains out of that one as well. But especially, the opportunity, I think, lies in the TPP and its possible evolution down the road into something broader, call it a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, or something else. If that looks likely to evolve in the way I described before without India, then the costs to India are going to be very high. On the other hand, if India joined, and you can look at tables 1 and 2 in the study, India's export gains could expand by over $500 billion per year when the agreement was totally implemented, say, 10 years out, probably a 10-year evolutionary period. That's more than a 60% growth in exports. That's something like a 10% growth in GDP. It's an increase of 5% or more in national income. These are huge potential economic benefits and provide a rare opportunity for India to take up and take advantage of if it moves down this path. Indeed, our study shows that India would gain more than any other participating country from this Pan-Asian trade arrangement. In percentage terms, not quite as much in dollar terms as China and the US because those are bigger economies, but in percentage terms, India would gain more than anybody else. So even in relative terms, it's a huge, huge winner for India if it would get into this business. Again, I would note the models almost certainly understate the actual payoff from the agreements. More likely, they would be even higher. I would also note that participation in this kind of process would greatly enhance India's foreign policy, its role in Asia, its role in the world. If it's outside this kind of trend, it's clearly going to be marginalized in a broader foreign policy as well as economic sense. If it gets in, plays the major role that it surely would, then of course it's a different ballgame. And so India's overall foreign policy, which again the Prime Minister has talked about, the Foreign Secretary has turned about India becoming a leader rather than a balancer, all that goes together in advocating this direction. One thing this would probably require is for India to join APEC fairly soon. At least heretofore, it's only APEC countries that have been eligible to join the TPP and implicitly an FTAP because that's being studied within APEC. The TPP, as it finally comes out, may have a broader accession clause. But to bring in countries outside APEC would be problematic because you'd open up the question of precedent. If one, why not 10 others? And so India's accession to APEC at an early stage would probably be an important, maybe essential stepping stone in this direction. APEC is ending its moratorium on membership, which had existed for the past 10 years, so that seems possible. When President Obama was in New Delhi in January, he indicated that he welcomed India's interest in joining APEC. That didn't quite say he supported it, but it began to move down that path, and one hopes that we could move further down that path. So, key recommendation here in the short run, in addition to all this reform requirement, is that India should clearly indicate its desire to join APEC, seek U.S. support, always predicated, of course, on undertaking a reform program of the type I talked about. But if it did that, the U.S. then ought to support it strongly. Final point, Proposition 10. The U.S. should be as helpful as possible if India chooses to go down this reform path. The U.S. has a huge interest, of course, in a successful India. In economic terms, it's already the third largest economy in purchasing power parity terms. In a decade or so, it'll be the third largest economy in market exchange rate terms as well. It can play a huge role in strengthening the regional and world economies and become a driver of global economic growth in the way China has in the past. In addition, our study shows that under free trade between the U.S. and India, which would be a component of the kind of regional arrangement I'm talking about, just like TPP is a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement, part of a broadened TPP would be a U.S.-India free trade agreement. Under that arrangement, U.S. exports would increase to India by 50 to 100%. Very clear, it's across the board, lots of sectors, big economic gains for the United States. And of course, major foreign policy gains from a closer U.S.-India relationship in terms of balancing political forces in Asia and having the same kind of geostrategic objectives that so many of our other policies pursue. We now have very close ties between President Obama, Prime Minister Modi, but they need to be institutionalized on the economic side the same way the civil nuclear agreement did to a large extent on the political and military side, if this is to be sustained, continued, and put into place. So, just to repeat, India has to undertake the needed reform strategy with some tangible steps to demonstrate its credibility, but the U.S. could encourage that by offering to help and support bringing India into these plurilateral agreements. In Geneva, the U.S. has blackballed China from a couple of those, but it could bring India in. And of course, supporting Indian entry into APEC and later into the TPP I have talked about. Now, if this regional focus, which is the primary recommendation of the study, doesn't work out, the U.S. and India could, again, predicated on Indian reforms, consider a bilateral free trade agreement. As I say, a key part of a broadened TPP would be U.S.-India free trade. You could do it bilaterally. And in the study, we lay out a number of ways that that could be done. There's some innovative ideas in there for components of a U.S.-India bilateral FTA. A services-only agreement might be one possible step down the road. Bringing the bit to a conclusion might be an investment chapter that would start the whole thing headed. But the regional course, I think, seems preferable for both countries at this point in time, so we should emphasize that. Well, those are the 10 propositions. Let me close with 2 very quick observations. One is that all this will, at best, take a while. The domestic politics in both countries are going to take some maneuvering. We're, of course, reminded by the recent trade policy debate in this country that it ain't easy. It takes a while. The strategy has to be done. The constituencies have to be mobilized. So that'll take a while. The international negotiating part of this is obviously going to take a while. And here in the U.S., to overcome that skepticism I talked about before, there's going to have to be some time taken to achieve it. So it's going to require patience and perseverance, but it also means trying to move as quickly as possible to get the process started. The second and final observation is that the stars may actually now be coming into alignment for some of this to happen. India is headed toward having the largest population in the world, the third largest economy, the largest middle-class consumer base, a major demographic dividend, the only youthful large economy growing rapidly, with therefore a rising labor force and increasing presence in the world economy, number 3 economy in the world. The Modi government clearly has a reform agenda, ambitious growth goals. It's got some tough sledding domestically, but what we're talking about here would hopefully reinforce that. The likely early creation of the TPP would offer an opportunity, a path for these kinds of reforms to be eventuated. The previous comment by President Obama that I mentioned suggests the U.S. might be supportive. The close ties between them, the close personal ties, could reinforce all this. The passage of Trade Promotion Authority here authorizes the U.S. to negotiate with any additional countries over the next 6 years. The pressure from China, maybe moving into these agreements itself, would clearly put a lot of heat on India, but the United States as well, to move down this path to broaden the other agreements. So the study concludes, India should adopt the Modi reforms domestically, add a substantial trade policy dimension to them, seek early admission to APEC and subsequent participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership as an essential component of achieving 8 to 10% growth and its other economic goals. To do this, cooperating closely with the United States, building on the Modi-Obama ties, could help achieve the outcomes. I hope the study is helpful in achieving them, and I look forward now to the remarks of our other speakers. Thank you very much.
Talk about a tough act to follow. Let me just say, Fred, when you came with Mukesh and Nelson and others to come and brief us about this product, I think if you recall the words I said were, we are in violent agreement with pretty much everything you're saying. Let me start by just saying what a pleasure it is to be here with you, Ambassador, saying the fact that Ambassador Singh, myself, Peter Lavoie, so much of my team, our PDAS, are here at a time when all of us are racing for the very consequential, very momentous engagements of the coming week, is an indication of the importance that we place on this report, on the Peterson Institute's body of work, and the fact that it is the Peter Institute that is putting out this very, very important report. So Fred, hats off to you, and thank you for the very timely nature of its release as well. And certainly to Mukesh and the U.S.-India Business Council for the enduring partnership, and the fact that you continue to be a vanguard for a deepening of the economic relationship. I have to say what a joy it is to have a partner such as Ambassador Arun Singh to be engaging at this critical moment in the U.S.-India relationship as an individual who not only knows us well, but is deeply invested and committed over the span of his career in strengthening that partnership. And so, Ambassador, it's wonderful to be able to be here with you. You can imagine that the SNCD, the Strategic and Commercial Dialogue, is an intensely busy time. So I will again thank you for excusing my inability to stay for the full conversation this afternoon, though I know it is going to be a very important and vibrant discussion. What I want to maybe just start with, because it's very tempting after the very thorough presentation that Fred gave to get up here and say I want to associate myself with the remarks of the gentleman from the Peterson Institute and then be done with it and walk out the door. And I could do that because there's not a sentence here that I would necessarily take exception to, and I speak on behalf of myself when I say that. But I think that this is an incredibly important report because it lays out the stakes for India, for the United States, and for the US-India partnership in all of its dimensions. In this very increased globalized world, we do recognize, appreciate, and prioritize how the geoeconomics of the region, of the Asia region, is shaping the world around us. And it is for that very reason that Secretary Kerry has put forward and reiterated both at his confirmation and virtually every meeting since, his prioritization on economic statecraft. To put it in the Secretary's words, foreign policy is economic policy, and economic policy is increasingly foreign policy. So we know that our diplomatic influence, our ability to advance our values, and even our national security is underpinned by our economic strength. And the welfare of our country increasingly depends on our ability to trade goods and services and to drive innovation around the world. Indian leaders know this as well. And with India fast becoming one of the largest and most diversified markets in the world, President Obama and Prime Minister Modi have committed to increasing our economic and trade partnership and to increasing our bilateral two-way trade fivefold from where we are currently at around 100 billion to 500 billion. And that has been reiterated by the president, by the vice president, by the secretary, and every official down the line. But to fulfill these aspirations of our leaders, the United States and India have added as a key aspect to our strategic dialogue the commercial track and elevated it to signify the importance that we place on deepening this partnership, on creating the pathways and operationalizing and implementing the ways to get towards these ambitious and we hope not just aspirational goals that we have set for ourselves. And so as we head into the strategic and commercial dialogue, this report will certainly help to focus attention of very senior levels in both governments and to recommit and reprioritize the steps that need to be taken. And I have to commend you, Fred, for not only creating a very cogent and compelling analysis, not only clearly articulating what is at stake, but also creating a very comprehensive roadmap of what will get us there. And I think that is a key strength of this work. Now, you alluded in your presentation to the many steps and reasons that define the strength of the American economy, what we have done over the decades to shape our economy into the world's largest and most dynamic economy, including the strong regulatory systems that reward entrepreneurship, protect innovation, and propel ideas to market. It is a system that has helped our companies to create and build some of the very best products that the world has to offer. And as a result, our companies and our economy are deeply integrated into the global supply chains, making them more productive and more competitive. And as the report highlights, and Fred's presentation does, India can and must do the same. The United States knows well that few can match the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit of the Indian people. In fact, as I'm sure Prime Minister Modi will note in his recent visit to the West Coast, some 15% of the startups in Silicon Valley have been founded by Indians and Indian Americans. community that makes up just 1% of the American population, but 15% of the startups in Silicon Valley. Now, India will soon have the world's largest and youngest population. And so you can imagine the enormous wealth of talent that India can draw upon. You can imagine what the citizens of India will be able to accomplish given the right education, the right training, the right enabling environment and opportunity. To take full advantage of this demographic dividend, India needs to create about 1 million jobs per month for the next 20 years, to provide skills training for about 400 million in its workforce. And for enabling that, the Indian government and Prime Minister Modi have put forward their vision of an ambitious Make in India initiative to create the millions of jobs in the manufacturing sector, to enable the Indian economy to be better integrated into global supply chains and markets. And we understand and we support that bold vision for boosting India's economic potential, because a stronger India is a stronger partner for the United States in all of the strategic goals and objectives that we share, not only in our bilateral relationship, but in our regional and global engagement. So we are invested in India's rise and in India's success for not only our own economic interests, but also, most fundamentally, our shared strategic interests. We need India to be a partner on some of these key challenges of combating climate change, of protecting the global commons, of ensuring inclusive and sustainable development and growth. And for that, the domestic strength and the domestic growth of the Indian economy is a key component. And as the report points out, much of India's economic growth will come from trade. And so for India to achieve that sustainable growth and development, it must assure global markets and international investors that it is indeed open for business. Efforts to simplify the tax code, to increase the ease of doing business will, in our opinion, and as Fred has pointed out, pay huge dividends for India's citizens and for its global economic stature. And most of us have watched very intently the platform of reforms that the Prime Minister and his team have sought to pursue and bring about. Reforms in opening up its economy, reforms in seeking to enhance competitiveness and increase trade-led growth. And we've seen some progress on the vision that they have laid out. But we've also recognized some of the headwinds that they have faced politically and the challenges that they have sought to overcome. And we do recognize that in vibrant democracies and vocal democracies such as India's, and let's face it, the United States, that these are difficult issues and that progress is not always swift or linear, and that it may well indeed take time. But in the meantime, I think as the report signals that the Modi government can take steps to really show its commitment to reform, such as strengthening intellectual property regimes, which is an issue that I know is very near and dear to our friends at the U.S.-India Business Council and so many in this room. And it's an issue that certainly we have many strong conversations with our Indian counterparts, because a strong IPR regime is absolutely critical to having a competitive and innovative economy. It is what has underpinned our own success, and while our system isn't perfect, it does attract some of the best companies from around the world. So India will soon be transitioning from being a net user of technology to becoming increasingly a net producer of technology and technological innovations. And to innovate, attract investment, compete, Indian firms are increasingly creating the new technologies and will need the protections to safeguard their innovations and inventions. The report also, I think, provides an excellent laydown of how the external frameworks can catalyze the reform process, and we do acknowledge, understand, and appreciate the importance of that. The WTO is certainly one example, and APEC, as you point out, is another. And India could greatly benefit from being a more active participant in the one and being included in the other. You noted the president's welcoming of that interest. I think we have said and acknowledged that for these global multilateral frameworks, that the inclusion of the world's third largest economy certainly makes a lot of sense and would create a more robust infrastructure. But there are several steps that India can take to make a stronger case. And today I would focus on just one, which is the US-India Bilateral Investment Treaty, or the BIT. If India and the United States could complete a bilateral investment treaty, it would and should become India's highest standard investment agreement. It would demonstrate to international investors, especially those from the United States, that India is indeed open for business. It would attract much needed capital from a variety of sectors, including infrastructure, energy, health, education, and many, many more. A high standard BIT with the United States would lock in many of the key reforms and create the foundation for a broader set of trade architecture, whether it's bilateral, whether it's regional, and give investors the confidence they need to make the long-term commitments and investments that India needs. So by pushing forward on that kind of an effort to create a high standard, high quality bilateral investment treaty, the United States and India, India could show that it is willing, able, and committed to joining other high standard investment agreements, making it more competitive and integrated into the global economy. The bottom line, and let me conclude because I know you want to get to a interactive conversation, is that we, the United States, want to see more Indian firms invest in the United States, and we want to see more US companies investing in India. We would like to see an increase on the $28 billion of investment in India. We would like to see more Indian investment in the United States, which can lead to more job growth here, and to see a more greater integration of our two economies. And we do think that despite the skepticism that you may often hear, that there is also a great deal of optimism in every level of the US government, including certainly 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, about India's potential, and not just potential, but a very real commitment to achieve that potential. So thank you very much again for an incredibly timely and incisive and important report, and an opportunity for me to be part of this event. I look forward to the conversation that ensues. Thank you.
I wanted to start by thanking Nisha for her comments and for the constant and incredible partner that she has been to take forward the India-US relationship. So thank you once again. Also wanted to thank Peterson Institute for doing this study, and Fred for working on it, because We can't think of another institute whose report would have got the same attention and somebody with Fred's learning and background. And that's why I shudder a little before I say, in response to what somebody of Fred's intellectual stature has said, that I don't necessarily agree with all the findings and analysis. So, of course, it would be useful to see how we would like to nuance it in some way, perhaps reflecting the very well-known assertion about the argumentative Indian. The Fred, of course, referred to the need for India to deepen its external engagement. And the fact is that today more than 50% of India's GDP is generated by the external sector. And that is more than the role of the external sector in US GDP or China's GDP. So there is already a very deep engagement that India's economy has with the external sector. Of course, we have to see how we take forward that process as we look at new opportunities. Again, listening to the first part, and the second part of Fred's comments, I thought there was a very important statement on how India and the US could work together to build the economic partnership, keeping in mind the strategic dimension. But listening to the first part, I got a sense that people would think that all was not going well. But just this morning at 10 o'clock, the Pew Research Center brought out its survey report where they said that bulk of the people in India felt that the economic performance was good and had improved over the past year, and that there was strong and growing support for the government and what it had been doing, including in the economic domain. So that's the assessment in India of the policies and the direction in which the government and government policies are headed. Fred did refer to the Indian economy being the third largest economy in the world. We must have done something right to get there, to that figure. Of course, we have some distance to go. The fact is that a lot needs to be done in India, whether we look at the demographic structure, or the fact that there are a certain number of people below the poverty line, or that almost 400 million people in India do not have access to commercial energy. Going ahead, a lot needs to be done in the background of the fact that a lot has been achieved in India. If you look at high rates of growth sustained over the past decade, the high rate of growth over the past year, and the fact that over the past year, FDI into India has grown significantly by more than 30%. Again, a reflection of how businesses are seeing the trends and opportunity in India. I would feel that there could be more valid in what has been, more validity in what has been stated in the report if we were looking at static structures. If the structure of production, the structure we were going to do our economic work in India remains static, then those were the challenges. But if the structures and the way we are going to work in India is going to change, then some of the observations perhaps need to be looked at. And one of the things that we are doing in India, and Fred did make a reference to that, is ease of doing business. Over the past 1 year, a whole series of steps have been taken by the government for improving the ease of doing business, and in terms of transparency, doing things online. And recently, one of our apex chambers, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, circulated a whole listing of the steps that the Indian government had taken over the past 1 year in terms of ease of doing business, and it spread into several pages. So these have been all incremental, significant steps, but because they are sort of step-by-step attainment, perhaps they don't get the same attention as something which is seen as dramatic and big. But if you add them all up, there has been tremendous change that is taking place in India. We have changed, for example, sectoral caps in investment, in insurance, in defense, in railway infrastructure. Many approvals have been made online. We recently did auctions, including coal auction, spectrum auction. It was done online. So these are processes that have been introduced. Also, as the government's program, and the government has put in a lot of emphasis on Make in India to expand manufacturing in India. As that program expands, then whole new set of opportunities will be created in India in terms of what is being made in India, what is the potential for us to become a part of the global supply chain, either through bigger arrangements or through bilateral arrangements. And we have several bilateral and other regional arrangements that we have been working on. Another area where the government has been putting a lot of emphasis is infrastructure, because there have been constraints on infrastructure. And again, as we seek to expand manufacturing, the infrastructure sector in India, be it in terms of roads, ports, power, telecom, would have to be expanded. And there is huge focus on that. And all that not only in terms of how we do business or generate more GDP in India, but will create additional opportunities for foreign partners and for trade and investment. And that is happening. When I talk to businesses here, when I talk to CEOs and other leaders here, I can see that they are engaging with those opportunities in India and looking at the potential going ahead. As part of this, one of the things we've been looking at is smart cities. And we have identified about 100 smart cities where there again would be emphasis on certain kind of infrastructure, economizing on use of energy, efficient transportation, and 3 smart cities have been identified for cooperation with the US, where there would be opportunities for US businesses, and US TDA and US private sector already engaged with that process. Another area where I feel there will be opportunity for the US private sector, both in terms of technology and finance, to become an important partner and to take forward this relationship would be renewable energy. Because as Fred mentioned, India needs to grow at 8 to 10% to meet the challenges we face, be it poverty, lack of access to commercial energy. But as we move ahead to seek that 8 to 10% growth, we would like to do it to the maximum extent possible on the basis of renewable energy. And when President Obama had visited India, in the joint statement, there was a reflection of our goal of reaching 175 gigawatt of renewable energy, out of which it would be 100 gigawatt of solar. And so this is an area where there is potential. And this is an area, when you talk to people in the Indian private sector, for example, who are involved in this sector, this area, they will tell you that a lot of expansion and construction is going on, especially on solar energy. And so when the Prime Minister is here next week, one of the significant interactions he's going to have with US government and the private sector on the West Coast is with a focus on renewable energy. Not just thought leaders, academia, but industry, government, startups, venture capital, the whole range, to see how we can work together more in the renewable energy sector. And I think, and Nisha made a reference to that, one area which doesn't get the same attention in terms of potential is innovation. US is a global leader in innovation. In many ways, India and Indians have been contributing to that process in the United States. Nisha made a reference to the Indian origin tech entrepreneurs who are there and the role they are playing. But even beyond that, Indian companies, through their engagement with US industry, including in innovation, have been contributing to technology development, innovation, and profitability of US companies in that sector. At the same time, there's a lot of innovation happening in India. You'd have noticed, for instance, last year in September, India sent a space vehicle to the Mars. And we were the 4th country in the world to have done that, and the 1st country in the world to have succeeded in the first attempt. And that is just one example. When I talk to senior leaders of high-tech US companies, Cisco, GE, and others, they tell me that they're doing a lot of cost-effective niche R&D and development work in India. Because given the resource constraints in India, the relative resource constraints, Indian scientists, innovators very often approach problems from a different perspective. And then through this partnership we can have a win-win for both India and the United States. Through this innovation, we will create new areas, new potential for cooperation, which will challenge the various assumptions based on which some of the analysis is happening today. For example, another area which will have a very important role is the digital economy. Because the way the digital economy is progressing is disrupting business models everywhere, including in the United States. And we are trying to, and India is very heavily engaged with the developments in the US digital economy sector. And we are trying to see how do we use that engagement for our benefit also, using disruptive business models, leapfrogging technologies, meeting our needs, minimizing use of resources. And so that, again, will be a great area for future collaboration. And again, when the Indian Prime Minister is here next week, one of the very significant interactions he's going to have in the West Coast will be with US leaders in the area of digital economy. Again, so I think as we look at all these issues, what I found very sort of encouraging and common in the comments of both Fred and Nisha is the recognition that there is a strategic dimension to this partnership. President Obama has said that the India-US relationship is going to be a defining partnership of the 21st century. US leaders have articulated time and again that they fully embrace the rise of India, and that the rise of India is in US interest. And our leaders have said that they see it as a relationship among natural allies. So for that rise of India, I think people, of course there is, and we heard that in terms of what India should do or the different options it should exercise, but I think people also need to look at what can the US do to contribute to that rise of India, the economic rise of India. And while working on that, we have to be mindful of the fact that the political economies of any two countries will be different. If one looks at it deeply, the political economy of the United States is very different from political economy of Europe. And the political economy of the United States is different from the political economy of India. And therefore, to expect that the norms and practices in one place would be automatically adopted in another, it doesn't happen anywhere. And therefore, as we build this, I think the challenge for us, the creativity for us would be recognizing these differences. How do we create new opportunities for cooperation? And I think that is, and as we deal with that, I would feel that sometimes when there is a difference, a disagreement, perhaps an understanding and a deeper understanding of the reasons for that would be useful. And I'll give you one example. You keep hearing about intellectual property rights, and a sense is very often created as if India, is a violator, an outlier. But when you look at it deeply, that is not true at all. When I talk to US high-tech industry here, they tell me, bulk of them, that they do not have IPR-related concerns in India, be it in terms of what they make in India and send to India, or what they are doing in India in terms of R&D and development work there and in terms of patenting. The US entertainment industry has concerns. Indian entertainment industry has the same concerns, and across different jurisdictions. So it's a question of us being able to work together rather than a you and us situation. The only area where there's significant concern is one industry, where the debate between incentivizing innovation and affordable healthcare is a debate that is not limited just to India, but is spread across a large number of countries in the world. And you see that debate also in the United States. But to use some differences like that to allow the painting of I would say, a disproportionately negative picture, I don't think suits anybody's interest. So let me end on that I think as we go ahead, as we work together to build our economic relationship, mindful of the strategic imperatives in that relationship, mindful of the compulsions and challenges that each society faces, but cognizant of the commonness of our interest, we will find a very, very effective and fruitful way forward. Thank you.
On behalf of the U.S.-India Business Council, I'd like to thank Fred Bergston for his cooperation. On behalf of our chairman, Ajay Banga, the CEO of MasterCard, on behalf of our board committee chaired by Frank Wisner and included Sue Esserman, Ken Juster, and myself, Mukesh Aghi, Diane Farrell, Amy Hariani, Michael Green, and others at the Business Council. Fred, we were looking for someone who could put together a paper to help put forward one of the key missions of the U.S.-India Business Council, which is to deepen the integration between the United States and India and to deepen the work of the business communities in strengthening commercial ties. We knew the most serious partner we could find to put together a solid, serious, reputable document that would lay out the facts for increased international integration and trade trade integration would be here at the Peterson Institute. We know that in this document, we're asking a good deal of the United States government, we're asking a great deal of India, but we're only doing so because Mr. Modi excited us. Mr. Modi said he was running for reforms. He has promised his people reforms. He has excited the US and the India business community with the prospects for India and with the promise for increased integration. And so we're absolutely delighted to be part of putting out this report, of supporting the work of the Peterson Institute. And we hope that in the days to come, as our leaders speak on Monday in both government forums and in the CEO forums, as your Prime Minister and our President meet on the 28th, we hope that these issues are front and foremost. As I sit down, I'll note that it's fair to say that the reason we have a US-Korea free trade agreement today is because some years ago, a man named Fred Bergston wrote a paper saying, you know, we ought to hear the economic benefits to the US and to Korea of a free trade agreement. Dr. Bergston, we hope that this paper is as successful as that one was. Thank you.
We've been blessed with not only a superb presentation, but 3 following excellent comments. We promised to end this at 1:30, and I've been told by our Chairman Emeritus that that is exactly what we should do. So we thank you all for being with us, and please pick up a copy of the report or download one, and if you can stimulate others to think about how we could advance the U.S.-India business relationship and a political relationship, you're on our side. Thank you so much.